Good afternoon, or should I say good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Deborah Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director of the Ernest Becker Foundation. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks especially to those of you who supported this program with a donation. The Ernest Becker Foundation was founded in 1993 to continue the work and application of Ernest Becker. Specifically, we examine the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and a societal level. We believe that understanding the function of death anxiety in our beings can provide tools to help us live more easily together as people. Over the years, the EBF has sponsored events, supported research, hosted speakers, and developed content related to Becker's synthesis and related science. Our quarterly newsletters examine various social issues in light of our relationship to mortality. We are a hub for interested people who come across this work and want to learn more and talk to others who have similar interests. Finally, if you find this webinar valuable, please support the EBF by signing up for our newsletter, telling your friends about it, and making a donation. I want to give you a very quick grounding in Becker and TMT for those who are first encountering these ideas. Please know that it will take time to digest, and there are lots of resources available to learn more about this at the EBF website. Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize in 1974 posthumously for his book, The Denial of Death. His key thesis is that culture shields us from death anxiety by enabling us to feel that we are part of something important and valuable that will live on after we're gone. In other words, we create culture to help ease our death anxiety. This is not to imply that this is the only function of culture, but it's an important one. In the mid-1980s, 3 social psychologists developed terror management theory to test Becker's synthesis. They have now demonstrated terror management theory in over 1,500 studies worldwide. We call terror management theory TMT. These TMT studies show that when reminded of our mortality, we will seek to affirm our cultural worldviews. We will like those people who are similar to ourselves more, and we will seek to marginalize people who we perceive as different from ourselves. Today's presentation takes the lens of Becker and terror management theory to talk about what motivates opposition to abortion. There are lots of ways to think about death anxiety and its impacts on people's beliefs on the issue of reproductive freedom and reproductive rights, but specifically today, we're looking at the area in which we think we have the most empirical data, and that is opposition to abortion. We will hear from 3 experts who will delve into the psychological motivations behind opposition to abortion, as well as how to overcome defensiveness for more productive dialogues on the issue. We hope that our intro comments will take about 40 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat and we will monitor it to get as many in as possible. And with that, I'll turn over to Tim McLeod, a reproductive healthcare educator with Planned Parenthood here in Washington State. And Tim will be our moderator for today. Welcome, Tim, and thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone. I stand among you viewers amazed at these experts here. I'm really, really excited about this call today. There is so much, my goodness. Death and anxiety might bring up some feelings for us. So I just want to make some encouragements for all of us today. One is to breathe, whether you're at home or here on camera. Just take a breath and be here in this present moment. This is a real opportunity for us to lean into something that's uncomfortable to talk about. And we just want to honor all of our feelings that might arise. As been said, there's going to be a chance for questions at the end. So if you think of a question, please hold it, write it down. We want to welcome those today in every way that we can. I want to acknowledge something around the language that's going to be used by these experts here. First of all, not everyone that has the capacity for pregnancy identifies as a woman, and that's going to come up with terms of fertility and reproduction and abortion, reproductive justice and adoption. And it's clear that in this group's expertise that we do embrace, these folks embrace in each individual's gender identity, expression, and experience. And we want to be inclusive to all regarding pregnancy, adoption, abortion, and reproductive health. That's really clear in our discussions. Some of the panelists will refer to a woman or women And we want to make sure that we're talking about the specific language because there is historical-based research with TMT that's the language that's used. There's also gender-related policies that are tied to reproductive choice, Roe v. Wade being one of them, of course. So to do this today is to acknowledge this long gender discrimination in our country, targeting women and related access to healthcare, fertility, and body autonomy. There's tension in the language that's used. There's tension in the language and how this is phrased, and a rights-based movement that has neglected and forgotten non-white folks and non-cis folks, that has to be acknowledged here. So we want to name that, but we also want to say that we are affirming and inclusive and trying to be inclusive of the lives of folks who are trans, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and everyone that is doing this work. So that's going to be a part of this anti-oppressive lens today. So there is language that's going to sit with us in this journey. Without further ado, I'm really excited to get into this. I'll be just on the background, and I'm going to get out of the way here.
My paper is on dualism and death anxiety, perceptions of women and responses to abortion. Although we don't know yet the Supreme Court's decision regarding Roe v. Wade, multiple states are already proposing, and in some cases passing, laws restricting or nearly banning abortions with startling encroachments on women's personal autonomy. The point here is not to assign blame for these extreme laws, nor is it to have a pro-con debate about abortion. My goal is to examine the perceptions of women often at play when the issue of abortion is raised. I'll begin with dualistic assumptions about men and women that underlie many of these laws and our own unconscious assumptions and expectations for what it means to be male or female. And then I'll draw on Ernest Becker's concept of death anxiety to better understand the responses that abortion can arouse in us. My hopes are that these insights might point us towards more fruitful ideas, reflections, conversations, and yes, compromises in responding to this painful and divisive issue. First, the dualism. We've learned to associate a specific set of qualities with what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female. This dualism has been applied to things that go beyond its gendered foundation, including ways that we've described reality, society, and individual identity literally for many thousands of years. This explains the similarities in our assumptions about the differences between men and women across time and place. Sure, there are some differences and variations on a theme, and the characteristics themselves are too simplistic to capture any individual life or person as a whole. But these dualized characteristics still reflect a lot of shared assumptions and perceptions about gender. Here are a few of the dualisms we're going to look at. We tend to see males as associated with the mind, with rationality, with culture, nature, independence, and roles of judgment, assertive roles and leadership roles. And we tend to see females associated with the body, with emotions, with the world of nature, more dependent and nurturing, deferential and service-oriented. Does any of this sound familiar to you? I bet it does. Have you noticed that the two sides of the dualism are not only different, but that also one side is more important, more valued, and more powerful? For example, we think of the mind governing the body. We think of rationality as mature and emotion as a sign of loss of control. We see culture as creative, the creativity of human beings, men mostly, and nature as the physical world, which is beautiful, but also a constant reminder that everything dies. The rest of these are probably obvious to you. I think if most of us were asked, we would probably agree that males and females are of equal value and deserve equal power. So it might be surprising to you to realize that we have all been socialized to value men and the qualities considered masculine more than women and the qualities considered feminine. If you're skeptical, Emily is coming up next, and she's got some empirical evidence for you. So just hold on. Next is death anxiety. The central problem all humans face, according to Becker, is how to cope with the knowledge that our lives are limited and death is our inescapable fate. This awareness fills us with dread and terror. Can it be that we are really just mere animals and our bodies will ultimately betray us? We live with a pervasive death anxiety, burdened by this awareness, but we can cope, Becker says, by finding meaning in our lives, by achieving something so significant and so good, so right, that we feel, at least symbolically, that we endure our own deaths through what we leave behind. We can do this in two ways: heroism and immersion. Heroism is self-assertion or self-expansion. Here we strive to stand out by demonstrating our power and talent in achieving something of great value that's recognized by others. The ongoing effects of our achievements enable us to leave our mark. So something of ourself endures and our death anxiety is soothed. Immersion is closer to service and self-sacrifice. It refers to committing our skills and resources to a meaningful, a good, and a right goal or cause. As that goal or cause is realized and lives on, we leave our mark. So something of ourself endures, and our death anxiety is comforted. Did you notice that those two strategies, heroism and immersion, are themselves, they may help us deal with our death anxiety, but they are also themselves dualistic? Heroism reflects our stereotypes of male abilities and characteristics, and immersion reflects our stereotypes of female abilities and characteristics. Becker at times affirmed these dualistic male-female stereotypes, and at other times challenged them. But interestingly, in his last work, he imagined them blending together, enhancing each other, and I would add, providing needed correctives for the dualism of heroism and immersion, and the broader male-female dualism as well. So how do death anxiety and dualism function in response to abortion? Abortion is a painful and complex topic that arouses intense death anxiety. Among the tools at hand to figure out why a woman might choose abortion are our largely unconscious stereotypes, but they work to her disadvantage. We might be musing on such a woman, it's likely the thoughts would come to mind that she's too emotional, childlike, lacking in wisdom. And isn't she meant to mother, to nurture? You can take it from there. These assumptions make it difficult to think about women and abortion itself with an open mind, or imagine responses to the dilemmas it poses that could be broadly accepted. A first and necessary step, however, would be to acknowledge that some laws and proposals to limit abortion call into question the very humanity and autonomy of women. For example, despite the brutality of rape, incest, and human trafficking, some laws in several states would require girls and women so brutalized to bring their pregnancies to term. Some laws go further, allowing their fellow citizens to sue anyone who helped them get an abortion. And then some laws reward those citizens whose suits succeed with $10,000. What have these laws done to women in such a predicament? Her body no longer seems to belong to her. She has lost control of it. She, as a specific person with a real life and traumas of her own, seems to be irrelevant, of no concern or value to her society. But her body is, at least as a means to a desirable end. And without a doubt, that end, in and of itself, is truly good and desirable. But tragically, that end is not desirable to her. Rather, it prolongs her humiliation, anger, and pain. The only acknowledgement of this sad contradiction comes in the form of the threat that her fellow citizens might be watching her to see if she tries to terminate her pregnancy, to put this profound injury behind her. If so, they can sue her enablers and have a shot at that $10,000 reward. However, is it that her fellow citizens have been set on her like bounty hunters? What kinds of controls? Another law proposed in Missouri intends to prevent women from traveling out of the state to end a pregnancy. This law would also apply to non-residents, to any woman who conceived in the state of Missouri. What kinds of controls would have to be placed on that visitor to Missouri? Would she have to be surveilled day in and day out for many months, tethered, jailed? And how could anyone know if she had conceived in Missouri? It's hard to believe such a proposal could become a law. It's so extreme. But it does reveal the fragility of women's hold on their own lives and bodies, in others' minds, if not yet in fact, and the ease with which that hold can be taken from them. Perhaps such extreme laws appeal to people concerned about abortion because they set up a right-wrong dichotomy that's simple and clear and assures them that the solution is clear also, and they are in the right. But the situations that result in considering abortion are seldom so cut and dried. Rather, they're often difficult, complicated, and lacking any perfect solution. This seems to capture something important in where we are right now. I'd like to end with what I think would be a good starting point for further discussion. We have to find a way to acknowledge that we're faced with a dilemma, not a problem, a dilemma, with no easy or perfect solution. But we must resist the temptation to solve this dilemma by depriving women of their autonomy and their full humanity.
Merlyn, Mowrey, thank you. And also to really honor your title, Professor Emerita of Social Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Central Michigan University. Thank you so much for starting this out today. So moving to the next one, Emily Courtney, please, Assistant Professor and Social Psychologist at the University of South Florida. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Tim. And I am very excited to be here speaking with all of you today. I also wanted to reiterate Tim's point at the very beginning of the meeting today, whereby though I'm going to be using the word women to refer to people in female coded bodies throughout the process of my talk, I do, of course, mean people who do present as women, people who do identify as women, people who have uteruses in general. And so it's important to, again, kind of acknowledge that exclusionary verbiage that's been used in traditional terror management research, and hopefully also bring into play the idea that we should focus more on that intersectionality moving forward. So as Merlyn noted, terror management theory is based on the works of Ernest Becker. So 3 social psychologists developed this theory as a way of trying to experimentally investigate Becker's main thesis. That being that humans are very much capable of abstract thought. We separate ourselves from other animals by this capability to engage in higher level cognitive processing, which unfortunately also allows us to be more than capable of recognizing the fact that we are eventually going to die. And so we try to get by, despite that death anxiety on a day-to-day basis, by employing different psychological defenses. Some of those we refer to most specifically kind of in terms of our research as cultural worldviews. So cultural worldviews being those beliefs, values, standards that we use to kind of shape our understanding of the world and use to give ourselves standards of living, things that we should attempt to achieve as human beings so that we might be remembered after we do eventually die. So it gets a little bit more complex because not only are reminders of death problematic, but the physical body itself is also an impermanent, transient, existing figure in the world as we know it. So when we think about our bodies, we are inherently reminded of the fact that one day our bodies are going to betray us and die. So in terms of the application of terror management theory, specifically to women's bodies, when it comes to the physical body, there's this element of creatureliness. We are animalistic. And so this animalistic or creaturely sort of component of lived experience serves as an existential threat. It can get a little bit more threatening, of course, to be reminded of just how physical one's body actually is. In an experimental setting, this can manifest as people's aversion to the physical components of sex, more of a focus on the romantic, uniquely human components of physical touch and sensation. When people are reminded of just how creaturely they are, they'll refuse things like foot massages, or even kind of distance themselves implicitly from traits that are more so associated with animals. As Merlyn noted, there is more of an issue when it comes to female presenting women's bodies, that being the fact that they are very much associated with nature to a greater extent than the bodies of men. And so Simone de Beauvoir, a French philosopher who focused very much on feminist existentialism, defined this in a way that I think is very pertinent. And basically what Simone said was that women are kind of plagued by this horror of feminine fertility, the inherent creaturely life-giving bodily functions of a body with a uterus serve to remind people more so of the fact that those bodies are more impermanent. And so we try to manage this through our cultural worldviews, through a perspective on women's bodies that is defensive. That defense kind of manifests as an objectifying or sanitizing sort of viewpoint on the bodies of women. And again, another quote from Simone: "In woman dressed and adorned, nature is present but under restraint." We investigated much of this experimentally in terror management research. The first study I'll present you with today is one titled Feminine Protection: The Effects of Menstruation on Attitudes Towards Women. This study from 2004 is commonly referred to as, and it especially like almost affectionately referred to as the tampon study. Now, in this study, a woman actor who was part of the experiment dropped either a tampon or a hair clip in front of the people who were there to participate in the study. Now, when people saw this woman actor drop the tampon, she was perceived as less competent. She was perceived as less likable. Individuals in the lab setting actually sat further away from her, and participants also reported greater objectifying views of women in general. And so what we see here is that this reminder of female physical bodily functions can be a little threatening to people, and also encourage them to distance from the physicality associated with that bodily function, to the extent that they actually distance themselves from the human being sitting next to them. In another study, there was a more nuanced approach to the study of objectification in the context of mortality salience as well. Now, when a woman was presented in a very sexual manner, she was more so associated with traits akin to those of animals. However, when a beautiful woman was presented to participants, they characterized her more as an actual non-living inert object, which also led them to believe that that woman could not feel physical sensation, especially pain. And so here we start to see more of the nuance that comes along with individuals' tendency to, again, try and sanitize the female body. It gets even more complex, right? So in this study, again, affectionately termed the trio of terror, there was an existential perspective on how women especially kind of internalized this objectifying perspective on themselves. Now, when people in a lab were reminded of female bodily functions, that again served as a kind of existential threat. It's again one of those reminders of corporeality, the body's impermanence. And so when combining the idea of death with a reminder of women's bodily functions, be it pregnancy, menstruation, or breastfeeding, it led women to actually internalize a very objectifying view of themselves. But the interesting part is that to the extent that women associated themselves with inert, non-living objects, that association served to actually reduce the extent to which they thought about death. And so here's where I get into a little bit more kind of theorizing about the application of terror management theory to discussions related to abortion. So as I mentioned, a lot of terror management research and even Becker's perspective is not really focused on the lived experiences of women. And so in terror management research, it's interesting because abortion is typically kind of treated as an individual political issue. It serves as a single item on just a slew of left to right, liberal, conservative kind of summary measures that are used to quantify ideologies or a cultural worldview. But as we know, and as we're discussing today, abortion is so much more than a political issue, especially for certain groups of people. And so the first kind of thing that I'd like to present is that it could be the case that abortion may be considered an additional bodily function that's unique to those with uteruses. And so to that point, the idea of abortion may serve as a greater threat to some people than others and could potentially constitute a uniquely feminine existential predicament. Again, things get more complex with abortion because unlike the trio of terror, abortion is not about giving life. Instead, it is a very stark death reminder. And so to that point, people are threatened by the idea of abortion, especially when abortion itself is tied in to people's cultural worldviews. And so in considering abortion as this uniquely feminine existential threat, it's important to keep in mind that in the context of terror management literature, what we've been able to find is the fact that when people are reminded of death, they'll double down. They'll get even more defensive when it comes to their own cultural worldviews. As Deborah kind of noted at the very beginning, this will show in the form of individuals continuing to marginalize and distance from people who are dissimilar from them. They might report derogation of outgroups, people who don't agree with what they believe to be true about their own cultural worldviews. And so the cultural worldviews that are intertwined with abortion are very important. And that's why we have such derisive sort of arguments about what abortion means, what it is, how it affects individual people. And so the first thing to consider is the fact that abortion serves as this kind of antithesis to the objectification and finitude of these threatening female-coded bodies. So to the extent that women may not be kind of using their uteruses as they're supposed to be used, that could encourage people to objectify a woman to an even greater extent. It could also be the case that abortion combats that objectification in an interesting way to a point where the trio of terror kind of parts of things may not add up right, which is interesting considering the fact that some viewpoints on abortion prioritize a woman's role more so as a vessel for another living body. So again, we see that dualistic component coming into play. Additionally, abortion might serve as a threat to traditional gender roles, where a woman is not prioritizing motherhood, nurturing, being in the home, those types of things associated with termination of a pregnancy. You're not going to have the motherhood components where gender roles really try to traditionally keep women in a certain place. And so it becomes even more interesting to think about the fact that even within 6 weeks, a woman's identity, this opposition to traditional gender roles, her autonomy begins to be pushed to the side. Another consideration in cultural worldviews when we're talking about abortion is religiosity or orthodoxy. So in some faiths, it's very much the case that abortion is seen as an affront to morality, an affront to what it means to be a religious person in general. On the flip side, though, in certain other faiths, abortion may be perceived as a right or necessity when the life of a pregnant woman is being threatened by pregnancy complications. Going along with that, abortion may serve as a meaning violation to the extent that we do see existential predicaments, right? We also see very much reliance on feelings of meaning in the world around us. And so where women are capable of choosing to get an abortion, if your kind of system of meaning says, no, we shouldn't have abortions, then a woman getting an abortion is a violation to that sense of meaning, can be very existentially threatening, and again, lead people to kind of double down on their own ideological worldviews. Additionally, as Merlyn noted, there are interesting components of heroism that come into play during discussions on abortion, to the extent that men may feel a need to save women in a way, which we might argue could be a component contributing to contingencies in anti-abortion legislation for rape and incest, which could be kind of a manifestation of more benevolent or comfortable forms of sexism. So again, we see a prioritization almost of the dualistic components that are associated to a greater extent with masculinity than femininity. The other very important consideration is, of course, the policing of bodily autonomy that comes along with discussions of abortion. It's dehumanizing in a way to try to strip a person's autonomy from themselves. Now, to the point that people may be policing bodily autonomy with laws like Merlyn discussed, if a woman can't even have sex on her own accord, all we're doing is just standing to maintain this form of patriarchal hierarchy that may be problematic, is problematic actually, in a variety of different ways for society in general, but especially certain groups of people. Further, this policing of abortion and reproductive rights contributes to a greater extent to continued marginalization of certain groups of people. So when we talk about abortion, there are all of these cultural worldviews, like I mentioned, that can be threatened by the presence of that death anxiety associated with the procedure itself. And so moving forward, it's very important to, again, kind of consider both flip sides of the coin, try to encourage people to take a step back from those death anxiety motivated defensive reactions to abortion insofar as abortion is related to death, but we also need to make sure that we are communicating in relation to that death anxiety, in relation to those death reminders, in a way that's going to do what we can to reduce defensive reactions and facilitate more effective communication moving forward. And so with that, as we try to kind of end on a more hopeful note, I'll move on to Lindsey. Thank you all so much.
Dr. Courtney, I just want to thank you very much. And before we move to Lindsey, just if anyone here, just a quick pause, if anyone here is wrestling with our own thoughts and feelings, the current political landscape, the research itself, how it's applied, how do we make sense of this, how do we make meaning from this, please hold those questions, jot them down. We do want to welcome those very soon. So our last speaker before those questions is Dr. Lindsey Harvell-Bowman, Associate Professor at James Madison University and the Director of the Terror Management Lab. Lindsey, to you.
Hello, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Everyone can see that, yes? Great. All right. So I want to take what Merlyn and Emily have said and with that in mind, talk about advocacy. How do we put all of that together to try to enact change? In this case with abortion rights. So before we get into things, I do want to set out a common definition for all of us as to what advocacy is. This definition comes from John Daly, and he defines advocacy as the ability to convince others to become invested in and to offer support for something that's important to you. I really like this definition. It comes from the book Advocacy, Championing Ideas and Influencing Others. If you're interested into the large web of actions that go into advocacy, this is a great book for that. So convincing others to become invested in and to offer support for a polarized issue like abortion isn't easy. And part of that is because polarization itself is tough. When we're polarized, we tend to see the world in binaries, yes, no, pro, con, support, no support. And what this does is it sets up a situation where one is easily triggered, and you therefore no longer recognize the continuum on an issue that falls within someone's acceptable stances on that issue. So in other words, our cultural worldview. In fact, we actually know from social judgment theory that attitude change is hard. And you really are dealing with moving someone within your latitude of acceptance or your cultural worldview. So no major attitude change will most likely ever occur. But what is possible is small movement. And small movement over time does lead to change. So in our case, what would most likely manifest or what this would most likely manifest as is when abortion is acceptable or not, or those same thoughts that live in someone's cultural worldview. So when you're working within this latitude of acceptance, you're no longer framing the issue as a yes or no support, no support. And by advocating within this framework, the language really helps to unpolarize the issue, making the space more inviting for attitude change. The real key to effectively advocating is to tear down the duality of the issue, as Merlyn had spoken about at the beginning today. As with most things, language does matter, and abortion and advocacy is no different. Language can bring people together, but it can also further polarize people. So in order to be able to advocate, you need to understand where the other person's coming from. You need to understand their cultural worldview, what brings meaning to their life. Ultimately, what this is going to do is humanize the opposing viewpoint. It's going to build empathy, and that empathy will neutralize any immediate day-to-day defenses or triggers that may occur as you are discussing this. Advocacy is hope. Right? Through decades of terror management research, we know that when our cultural worldview is threatened, or we see a threat like an opposing viewpoint to abortion, we will defend it at any cost. There are easy ways to do this, like punching someone in the face, bringing instant gratification and maybe some jail time, or a slower, more effective way, such as communication. Here's the thing, instant gratification is great, but it doesn't fix the problem, but communication does. It just may not feel as great in the moment as punching someone in the face, but long term, I guarantee it will feel fantastic. As a person who has advocated for herself and many other people in various contexts, there's no better feeling than whether that advocacy campaign was short or long, a month or several years. Seeing success and the ability to help yourself and help others is highly rewarding, much better than the more violent alternative. So with that in mind, I'd like to share 3 ways that really can help toward making long-term changes with abortion rights, no matter where you stand on the continuum. So 2 of those really go together, mindfulness and empathy. Mindfulness tends to lead to empathy. And when we talk about mindfulness in this context, what we're talking about is being mindful of how other people think. So as you start to engage in conversations with others that share differing viewpoints than you naturally will become mindful of all of the different viewpoints of a specific issue, on this case, abortion. There's lots of different opinions, right? It's not just yes, no, it's support, no support. You're no longer going to view people with the opposing views as the enemy by taking this approach. You'll see them as human beings in a world where we all meet the same ending, death, right? So why not understand people along the way? You will develop empathy through this approach, and empathy is then the key to neutralizing your triggers and defenses. And that will enable you to have these meaningful and change-inducing conversations. So by seeing each other as human beings, right, you start to focus on your similarities rather than your differences. And what emerges is an open and inviting space where hard conversations can be had and change can be allowed to happen. Through empathy and being mindful of viewpoints that are other than your own, you can use those skills in starting to effectively protest. And I would argue that protesting can probably give you as much gratification as violence. And the reason I say that is because within a community, through protesting, you're sharing your ideas and thoughts in a peaceful and legal way. And through the media attention of that protest, you're being heard. And so this is not only incredibly powerful for you, but also for the conversations that tend to follow protests. But there is a problem with protesting. It naturally sets up a classic us versus them scenario, as terror management theory would predict when faced with an existential threat, such as an opposing viewpoint. But as we take the approaches that I've already mentioned and we start to recognize a person with the opposing viewpoint as a human being, consequently showing empathy toward that person, we can ultimately protest more effectively, because oftentimes we're so focused on our view of the world that we begin to see others as just an enemy and not a human being. But the key to effective advocacy when death anxiety is involved, as is the case with abortion, you ultimately want to work on death acceptance through talking to people with differing views. Protesting is an affirming action for all sides of the issue, no matter where you fall, and it has to happen for hope. So this all sounds great, and things always seem great on paper, and theory is always elegant when it's written out. But if I'm being truthful as a person who has engaged in both formal and informal advocacy campaigns, advocacy isn't easy. It's not immediate, and it's hardly elegant. It's tough, it's gritty, and it requires more flexibility on the part of the advocator than I promise you will ever want to give or feel comfortable giving. As Merlyn and Emily have pointed out, we're fighting biological and psychological preconceptions about death. Those are not easy to overcome for any of us, and we're constantly fighting them as we try to enact change through these difficult conversations. Advocacy takes time, multiple approaches to combat these preconceptions, and oftentimes soul-crushing patience. I may have a little bit of experience with the patients. So last, I want to lay out some recommendations for how to best advocate for issues like abortion when considering the stronghold death anxiety has on us all. So the first thing that you can do is make your audience an in-group. This involves building language that's inclusive to your target audience. And to do this, you really need to keep two things in mind. One, you need to understand the dominant pre-existing cultural view of your target audience. So are they pro-choice? Are they pro-life? Where do they fall in this continuum? Second, you want to identify an aspect of their cultural view to highlight what you think the audience will relate to. That can be issue specific, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something as simple as just noting a similarity that you both have. Maybe you're from the same town. Maybe you like to eat the same food. What we know from decades of research in advocacy and persuasion is that people will be more apt to listen to you and more apt to do what you're asking when you build those similarities. So second is instill a sense of common humanity in your message. And again, that's bringing in that empathy. This will decrease audience tendencies to scapegoat. And also in some circumstances, research has shown that we can build an audience member's self-esteem through this and make them aware of the helpful aspects of their cultural worldview. So speaking of cultural view, you also should provide worldview consistent and credible action steps. So you could give them one worldview consistent action step, or you could give them one or two. I suggest multiple. This gives you a better chance of alignment with your audience versus just having one, right? The key in all of this with efficacy and worldview consistent action steps is efficacy. Efficacy is key. When we talk about advocacy, we're talking about making sure the audience feels and believes that they can engage or do these actions. They believe they can be accomplished. So break that issue into smaller actions like writing to a congressperson, something very simple, going to a meeting, signing a petition, something very simple for them to do that they feel that they can accomplish. Next is trying what we call the funnel approach. This is starting discussions of the issue at a distance. So you might, before you get into the current abortion climate, maybe you want to talk about abortion a few decades ago, right? Then get them comfortable with the topic before you lead into the actual current climate, which will serve as that existential threat. What it does is it gives people time to consider that issue and be less defensive when that threat does emerge. When the threat does emerge, though, you want to reduce any resistance and discomfort. And you can actually do that before you ever have this meeting. And that really is just making your audience comfortable, right? Whether that is having a meeting on where they want to have a meeting, where they're comfortable, buying them a Starbucks or something, right? Just whatever makes them feel comfortable. And that will help reduce that resistance and discomfort. Last, utilize the research that's out there on advocacy, as well as utilizing communication experts like myself. There are a number of us out there that are more than happy to assist you with your advocacy needs, and we love to do it. Last is ending on a hopeful note, and that's really it really speaks to more of the efficacy that we spoke to earlier, is making the task at hand not feel so daunting. People need to feel like they're able to do it. If they feel like the issue is too big, too daunting, they're never going to engage in what you would like them to do because they simply can't see them succeeding. So I want to close with really this idea that communication is hope. It is the only way to make effective change, and arguments and advocacy is all we have to combat these biological and psychological preconceptions. So it's through communication and understanding of all viewpoints that will enable empathy and the ability to be able to live with others and work to change important issues like abortion rights. That is all I have for you.
Dr. Harvell-Bowman, thank you very much. Thank you all panelists. Thank you for your patience with me trying to keep up with the sequence of things. I have so many notes, I have so many questions, but it's not about my questions today. We're going to make space for the group. A lot of gratitude. I'm sitting here I want to be honest, thinking about my own socialization and my own identities that I carry, and just feeling a lot from everything that you've shared. So with our questions here, we just have one question that has come up. It's a common question that get asked about this research and its application. So we'll go from one panelist to the next, and then we'll open it up to the whole group. And panelists, if you can keep your answer to about 2 minutes or so, I think that would allow us to have a full half hour. So Merlyn, I'm struck at how we've almost come full circle with Lindsey speaking strongly about us and them and advocacy. You spoke to those dualisms, you spoke to the pro and con, male and female, masculine and feminine. So my goodness, like if this is a part of this world that we're looking at, now that we've come full circle, what does this mean for you and your the way in which you see this not as a pro-con discussion?
I think that the pro-con discussion enables you to avoid looking at the kinds of issues that Lindsey and Emily and I have been discussing. And we have the empirical evidence for this kind of dualism. We have actions to take in the face of such, when those things are triggered. And but I think it's so persistent in us that we do need some way of backing off that topic and putting the topic second to deal with after we have tried to make some sense of this conundrum. I think we need to stop looking for a solution and look for a compromise. Abortions usually arise in situations that are truly tragic, and what you're trying to go for is the best possible thing, not the perfect thing. There will not be a perfect thing. And our either or thinking, also very dualistic, but also very comforting, will not get us there.
And Merlyn, can I ask one more personal follow-up question?
Sure.
I'm just curious if we're speaking to a compromise or a spectrum as opposed to a right or wrong way, a perfect solution or not a solution. How does that feel for you in your research to know that there may be many solutions at play?
It doesn't surprise me. I think when you are willing to reflect and look at a variety of sides of an issue, most of the time it'll get us off of our most extreme assumptions and preferences. And if we are open-minded enough to listen to the range of things, and instead of getting in a stance of opposition, to try to seek some solutions, I think it can be a very powerful insight, and I think it's a motivating insight if we're willing to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. So our next question goes to Courtney. And this question is, despite the defensive reactions to issues involving death, is there any potential to use reminders of death for pro-social good? That is, how do we twist death in a way that actually benefits others, that benefit other people?
Absolutely. So that's always such an important question, something to really keep in mind when we try to do the strategies, implement the strategies Lindsey talked about, and really attempt to make a larger in-group with people with whom we might not have common ground. And so the interesting part about death-related anxiety is that death awareness can be coupled with other salient values in order to try and encourage people to take certain steps or behaviors, viewpoint shifts, etc. So in one paper, what we found was that under conditions where people were thinking about death, priming them too with the social importance of the value of tolerance actually led people to express fewer Islamophobic views. In another study where we kind of tried to take a more health-based approach, we found that making people think about COVID, but also making people think about a collective we rather than an individual I, that collectivist kind of perspective worked with that death awareness to encourage people to intend to actually perform COVID-19 mitigation behaviors. So to the extent that people were aware not only of death, but also of that collective we, they were more willing to stay home, not go to restaurants, get vaccinated, wear their masks. And so that being said, we can almost harness the awareness of death in a way that might exacerbate the values that could do good in the world around us. So when we do try and make people think about tolerance, when we make them think about the collective, when we make them think about other values that are for the better good, the greater good, the betterment of society as a whole, perhaps we could take a very death-related issue like abortion and say, here are these other important values that you might want to consider when you do consider your own viewpoint, your own defensive reactions to that death anxiety. So maybe, hopefully, it just depends on what sorts of values we might want to prioritize in these conversations.
Yeah. And my goodness, I can't help but ask, like, with all this research, this Islamophobic research or this COVID research, like, when people are primed, these interventions that were made, I'm a layperson, I'm not an academic. What does this mean for me? Like, how do I welcome those things with my death anxiety that I may or may not be aware of? How do I apply those things in just my everyday life? What's an example?
Oh, that's such a great question. So the reason we used the collective we in our studies on COVID is because there were CDC-related communications that said things to the effect of, together we can slow the spread of COVID-19. So even just implementing simple verbiage like that when we do talk about things that are related to death could ultimately be beneficial so long as we do it very strategically.
That is really helpful. And I know that we're not out of this pandemic yet. So I want to hold that.
Yes.
So good.
We need to keep focusing on the we.
Thank you so much. Okay, and this last question for this section goes over to Lindsey. And this question is, you spoke a lot about communication, empathy and humanity, mindfulness, like the value of communication from this standpoint. how do you keep your own emotions in check, especially if the issue is personal, when advocating for issues like abortion?
It's hard. It's really hard. And especially if you're advocating for yourself. I mean, I think of, we're talking about big advocacy with a big issue like abortion, but it could just be, simple everyday advocacy too. Oftentimes that everyday advocacy is personal as well, right? So for me, and I think in general, you really have to know what triggers you. You have to really be self-aware, be aware of your reactions to things, that they may be tied to death anxiety, right? Or they may be tied to some other trauma that you've experienced in your life, and really being aware of that and going internally, yep, I know why I'm reacting to this. I'm still going to listen, but I know why I'm having this reaction, and really trying to get past that. It can be done, but it's really hard. It's really hard. You really have to stop yourself in the middle and think, why am I reacting this way? And really, be open, have that cultural worldview, if you will, of wanting to understand where others are coming from, even if you adamantly disagree with them.
If I'm selfish, isn't it funner to just have us, them? Isn't it easier for my brain and personhood to be like, this is my camp, that's your camp? No, it's like,
yes, very easy. Yep. Easy for ourselves, easy for our brains, not so good for humanity and society.
Thank you so much, y'all. There are some really great questions. I'm looking at y'all. I can see you now. Does it feel good to you to move to questions from the audience here? And then, so I'll do my best to repeat them back. And I'm gonna, if I can, I'll try to name who the question is from. I'm hoping this is okay to do out loud. I'll monitor if I'm getting a message otherwise. Okay. And so I'll repeat the question. And does it feel good to y'all? Whoever feels like, ooh, I have something to add to this, I'll take it. All right, so keep me in check here. So these are really strong. So this first question comes from Simona Demel. And the question is, if opposition to abortion is mostly rooted in death anxiety, if that's true, then how do pro-choice people deal with death anxiety? What do y'all think? Whew.
So I can get us started on that question. So when it comes to worldview that is based in pro-choice ideology, when we talk about defensiveness to death awareness, when death awareness is sparked by something like abortion, it doesn't really matter which side of the coin your views might rest upon. It's going to lead you to double down on your own viewpoints. And so even pro-choice people will deal with the threat of death by doubling down on just how pro-choice they are. So that's where we see this, again, perhaps sometimes inconvenient form of dualism in response to death awareness. People will have a tendency, as Lindsey kind of said, to make those out groups, us versus them. And so it's important to be mindful not only of the views of others, but again, your own views, and try to temper those in a way that's going to allow for successful discourse with someone with whom you might not agree. And so really just kind of the simple sort of answer is that if you're pro-life, abortion might make you more pro-life. If you're pro-choice, discussion of abortion might make you more pro-choice in that moment. And so recognizing the fact that that is how we are kind of wired to deal with that anxiety arising from death awareness is going to be very helpful in facilitating useful conversation.
Thank you for that question, Simona.
May I add something to that?
Please.
And this is on the hopeful end. I'm not a TMT researcher, but years ago I heard Sheldon Solomon presenting information about TMT. And, some of it is just so depressing. I was asking him, are there any hopeful signs? And he said the most interesting thing, which I've been trying to get him to turn into an experiment, but for obvious reasons, it seems hard to do. He said that one of the things they started discovering, they tried this over a period of time, that when they would have the people come in, the ones who were primed for death, a death prime, were split into groups. And one group was simply given the death prime, and then they went on to the experiment. The other group, before they left, the person explaining the experiment said, don't respond with your gut. Take a minute and think it over. And that group showed a much more open-minded, tolerant response to whatever the situation it was. Their death anxiety and their predictable responses changed. And I think that's a very hopeful thing. If our power, if we're just simply willing to reflect, take a deep breath, step back, and some of the things that you've said encourage that, we could see some different outcomes.
I agree, Merlyn. I think the challenge in that and the complication comes when that takes time, right? What do we choose? Do we choose the violence or do we choose the long-term option? And I like the long-term option, and I like the hope, that the idea that if we stop and we're mindful of not only how others are thinking, but how we're reacting to it, that's the only way that we're going to be able to have these conversations. And until we are able to really spread that message to others, advocacy isn't going to work without being able to be mindful of others and how you are acting as well.
If you don't mind, Tim, I'm going to jump in here as well. This is the executive director's privilege. Something we also talked about in response to this question is sort of the minimalization of what the act of abortion means. I relayed that when I was 12, 13 years old and passionate about this issue, I absorbed the idea of describing it as just a mass of cells, and wasn't at a place to acknowledge that it's a killing of a life or an ending of a life. I'm still pro-choice, but I also accept that part of it. And I think that maybe part of what's necessary to move dialogue forward.
Thank you, Deborah. And please do come in anytime you feel compelled to do so. Okay, so y'all bear with me. There's some great questions coming in. I want to give this to y'all. This is from Daniel Legte, EBF's former vice president. How do we reconcile the individualistic perspective that choice lays 100% with the woman who must have the right to control her own body, with the more communitarian view that emphasizes communal responsibility? For example, it takes a village for nurturing children, daycare, public parks, public education, positive moral socialization, etc. I can repeat that question if y'all need, and otherwise, if anyone wants to connect with this question, please.
Okay, so I can hop in on this one, maybe start us off. So when we discuss, again, the duality of individualism versus the greater good, the collective, it would be critical to keep in mind that while it takes a village, it also takes an individual who is going to contribute to the village as a whole, right? Like groups of people are only as strong as the weakest link, right? And so in attempts to allow people feelings of autonomy, feelings of control over their own bodies, that autonomy may instead translate into strengthened communities. So for example, one of the worldviews I kind of touched on my last part of my presentation was the idea that abortion could just be a means of continuing to uphold gender hierarchy and marginalize people who have been traditionally marginalized in society. That's not a society that we would want. And that is kind of, again, the antithesis to what a good communal society would look like if we are continuously disadvantaging groups of people who would be considered outgroups through this terror management sort of perspective, what does that say about the group as a whole? What does that say about society in general if we try so stringently to disconnect individualism and communality? So again, just trying to keep in mind the fact that we all have to kind of work together, and sometimes that collaboration comes in the form of allowing people to take care of themselves, whatever that choice might look like.
Emily, if I can ask just an adjoining question to this. You mentioned the horror of feminine fertility, and this idea that person carries a greater threat, possibly, with the context of terror management theory. Is it fair to say that if that's true, that this person might have a greater burden themselves, that ties into this sort of how do we honor the individual and what they have at stake with their own choice, body autonomy versus the village that they live in? You know what I'm trying to say here? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that is such a great question. That's something that I am actually kind of digging into in some of my lines of empirical research myself, right? Like as we're talking right now, I'm submitting some paperwork for it. So really, what we're trying to figure out in terms of furthering the field of existential psychology, rather, is the notion that existential predicaments can be just like lived experiences in that they can differ from person to person. And many of those experiences could be gendered in nature. And so to the extent that certain groups of people may be differentially affected by certain existential crises, it's important to kind of keep those things in mind. And so for women, not only is there the threat of death, not only is there this threat of feminine fertility, there's also this, again, dualistic component, this decision making whereby a woman would be like, should I be a career woman? Do I want to be a mother? Do I want to be a nurturing person? So we're starting to get a little bit of a basis in terms of, actual data, looking at the extent to which existential threat could be specifically feminine. We're looking at that in the context of decision making. We're looking at the context of sexual assault is one that we're working on right now. We've put out a really cool theoretical paper if anyone is interested in reading that in the near future. But so again, just trying to very much keep in mind the fact that existential predicaments can differ from person to person. Like Lindsey said, being aware of not only your own triggers, but the triggers of others. And again, kind of trying to utilize that in a way that's going to lend to discussions that may minimize triggers longer term.
I have a simple thing to add to this. I'm going back to what you were saying about the community, the value of the community. We could look at our country as a large community. And in terms of, if you look at the statistics, most of the people who seek abortions have reasons of poverty, large families, they may be facing unemployment. I mean, there are financial issues here that can be determinative of people's decisions. And so one thing we could do with the large community, meaning our country, is look at our social and economic policies and try to do something about poverty.
Lindsey, your thoughts? Do you have any on this as well?
I agree with all that has been said. I mean, it again comes down to the understanding not only your triggers, but other people's triggers. And I think sometimes understanding your triggers that's incredibly difficult. I think it's probably easier than understanding why other people might react to you, but that's all part of the mindfulness, right? So why someone might not be at first willing to listen to what you have to say, that probably has nothing to do with you. It has to do with how they're reacting to the issue with something in their background. And I've always been a strong proponent of saying you don't know what's in someone's background, right? And so you really can't assume anything, and all you can do is talk. And I know I'm saying the same thing, communication, but it's through talking that you'll get to know a person and get to know those triggers and get to know why maybe they weren't as warm and receptive to your ideas at the beginning.
Lindsey, can I ask a question that I think, obviously, y'all are the experts with the ideas of heroism and immersion. Mindfulness wasn't a term, at least as described at that time. I know that Becker was very much interested in Eastern philosophy and so forth, but how does mindfulness sort of compete with ideas of heroism, or does it dovetail into how we understand immersion in modern day?
That's a good question. I would lean to Merlyn, who has, I obviously know Becker's work, but since Merlyn spoke about Becker, I would lean to her to perhaps address that question.
Would you phrase that again, please, Tim?
Absolutely. If I have this correct, one of the anecdotes that Becker offered was this idea of heroism, which Emily was saying that can have some trappings of its own, right? So the savior, that especially with a male or masculine presenting person, and socialized power. But so mindfulness, we're hearing, is one of the things that will help us remain rational, to keep those triggers in check, to stay present to how we are fraught with this death anxiety. Does that compete with the ideas of heroism? Does it compete with the idea of immersion?
I think that's sort of a hard question to answer. Heroism always has the dangers of excess, and those dangers of excess are probably more dangerous when we are not self-aware, when we're not self-critical. Becker does talk about heroism being threatening when we go too far. There is some sense in which we realize we've stuck ourselves out too far. And then we get back with the dynamic between heroism and immersion, between standing out and pulling back. I think finding a more modest kind of heroism is probably a safe strategy, both for the person, but also for the culture in which someone is exhibiting their heroism and trying to get more and more power and more glory.
Thanks, y'all, very much. Okay, so we have another really great question that is coming to you. This is from Jillian Tullis. The question is abortion always a tragedy or tragic? How would more neutral framing of abortion as healthcare, for example, help folks see abortion in less binary terms?
Yeah, I think that is one of the solutions, what you just said, right? I mean, framing definitely matters. The type of language that you use, and I only had 10 minutes, so I couldn't really go into that in detail, but yeah, absolutely. We choose words for certain reasons, and when we are advocating for something, and those words can make a difference, and framing abortion as healthcare would definitely change some of the conversation. However, part of the issue is that, yes, some people believe that it is healthcare, but then you have some people that don't, not to put, and then you have people in the middle that are, maybe sometimes this, maybe sometimes that, right? And so when you're advocating and when you're having those conversations, just putting it out there that abortion is healthcare, and using that, it's not even framing at that. I mean, yes, it is framing to a certain extent, but you're just using that language, right? If you use that language with somebody, they would have to essentially stop you and say, wait, no, that's not right. And chances are there are people that will do that, but the more that you use the same language over and over again, the more people will become comfortable with it. So I'm not sure what the others have to say, but yes, absolutely.
Y'all, please interject if you have a thought. There's a piece here, a follow-up from Merlyn. But Lindsey, can I clarify if part of the aim here is to humanize other? Does that include using language that they use to describe themselves and their political platform? Anti-choice, pro-life, as an example here.
That is a really good question and probably makes everyone a bit uncomfortable, right? Makes me uncomfortable thinking about it. I wouldn't use their language. And the reason I wouldn't do it is because that almost seems like manipulation to a certain extent. And it will cause you undue harm as well, psychologically, I suspect. I think there is a way to have these conversations and not use their language, but I can see where you're saying where you may have thought that. Definitely, I would not recommend completely vacating your language for theirs. There's compromise, right? And I think it was Merlyn that talked about compromise, or maybe it was Emily, but compromise is key here. Nobody is ever you're not going to get to a point where we have deep empathy for each other without compromise. And if you were to completely vacate your language and use theirs, that wouldn't necessarily be compromise. It would be really uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable thinking about it, actually.
Understood. Thank you very much for going there. That actually clarifies a lot, I think. Merlyn, there's someone who's asking if you can clarify a little bit about, you bring up some points around this is not about good option and a bad option. This is sometimes about two bad options. Does that resonate with you? Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, my point was that when we're thinking absolutistically, we think that things are good or bad. And one of the concerns I have about the ways that the examples I was giving of these extreme laws is women's bodies and their experiences, their lives, the trajectory of their lives, those things are set aside to meet an ideal, and that's to save the life at all costs. And when you think about that as a goal, it is a good goal. But if the cost of that goal is so high that women are deprived of their own control of their bodies, of their lives, of decisions like this, and other people are put in charge, you have done something not to women, something profound to women, but also profound to democracy. Is this a social good? It's certainly sexist to disregard women to the extent of some of these extreme laws, but neither side, if one side wins completely, the other side loses completely. And each of these sides has something that is worthwhile and deserves to be treated with respect and care. So I think that I think it takes courage, but it also is a more creative and responsible position to recognize that at the extremes, each has something good, but you can't have both. And at some point, you've got to decide what's worth saving. And you can't pick one or the other. I think an only solution that we can live with is going to be some kind of a compromise. And I think getting used to the idea that I may not get what I want, there's going to be something bad about what we get. Our willingness to just accept that we can't have everything and to think with more nuance. First of all, my concern here is that we need to be thinking about women as though they're human beings, and what we owe them and what they owe themselves and have a right to. So I think I'm willing to give up on either of the extremes, but it takes some kind of courage and creativity and willingness to compromise to come to what that position would be. And I don't have one that I'm suggesting here. That really wasn't what I was interested in this paper. Just trying to see that the first step can't be sacrificing women's autonomy and their humanity. That can't be the first step. And I don't know what it's going to be, but until we decide that, I don't think we should try to resolve this problem.
If I can, we have time here. We're coming to a close, but there is a pretty powerful question that lies within the context that you just framed, which is having a dialogue and a rational discussion and entertaining different points of view is one thing, but policy and law is something else, which is a binary, which has impact, which has consequences. And so if I'm hearing part of what you're saying, the question that I'm worried about giving this to y'all, but we're going to go there. So, what is the implicit immortality that is present for these Supreme Court judges who want to overturn Roe v. Wade? If we're talking about policy and law, this is highest in the land, highest court in the land. Do you want to speak to this at all in any way?
I have a thought. So there's a very, I don't want to say beautiful irony, but almost funny in a way, to the extent that the majority of people in the United States do support some degree of pro-choice abortion-related legislation. The irony, of course, lies in the fact that elected officials, Supreme Court justices included through their appointment by elected officials, they don't reflect that same overwhelming majority-based viewpoint. And so given that political structure is not unrelated to gender hierarchy, it's important to consider the fact that overwhelmingly men in power are the people who are making overarching decisions for people whose viewpoints are not necessarily in accordance. They don't match up with those of their constituents. And so Supreme Court justices are in a difficult position whereby they're fighting this battle between their own viewpoints and the viewpoints of their constituents, to the extent that they may be perhaps prioritizing their viewpoints, their positions above those of the general populace. So again, kind of that doubling down of cultural worldviews, of gender hierarchy, of social structure, especially in response to something so intertwined with death in abortion. So none of it is going to be ideal for anyone, but of course these Supreme Court justices who are appointed for life are not people who reflect the viewpoints of the people who got them in their jobs. And so being aware of who is in office, how our underlying social and political structure kind of works, may give us credence to further interest in pro-socially dismantling those structures. It's just a matter of ensuring that people's voices are heard in a way that's effective and respectful.
I would come at this, I think those are very good ideas. There's another angle that we might look at here. I don't doubt that for the Supreme Court justices you're talking about, feel very sincere in their decisions about being pro-life. But I'd like to point out, not by individual, but by groups, most people who oppose abortion favor capital punishment. Even when the research shows that they acknowledge that mistakes will be made, a good percentage of them, but they still go for it. There's lots of things you can look at to see when we really stand by those values. Most people who oppose abortion also do not support poverty work. They don't think the government should pay for poverty work. They are less likely to want to support schools and put the money into those kinds of projects. So there is a lack of consistency, and I don't have those numbers. I read something about this recently, but I didn't write down any numbers. But it is the majority And I think that's a pretty stark kind of way of asking what kinds of lives deserve to be saved. So it's not as consistent as it sounds, is the point. They've made a compromise. And at that point, we have a right to ask for other compromises.
Agree.
Lindsey, do you have anything?
It is. I know we have 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to say agreed.
Yeah, I just came out to, do a little closing. I'm so proud of you all for bringing this knowledge. And Tim, thank you. You did such a great job directing traffic. For those who signed up for this webinar, we are going to email a copy of our communication advocacy guide, which captures some of the ideas and gives additional information. And if you didn't sign up, but you still want it, send a little email to info@ernestbecker.org. In addition, if you are someone working in the field of abortion rights or any healthcare angle on this, we are interested in doing more studies. In some ways, we leave you with more questions than answers because there has not been sufficient study. And we've been thinking a lot on, what it would look like to apply terror management to some of the needs of organizations thinking most deeply about this issue. So we'd love to partner, not as like a financial thing, but as a thought thing and get together. So you can also contact us at info@ernestbecker.org and find a lot of background information. We are working on a webinar coming up about gun violence and death anxiety. So, sign up for our newsletters and sign up for our e-alerts to make sure you get that. And just want to once again lift up the wonderful way that our presenters have joined us today. And I hope you'll agree that this was an experience where you have gotten a perspective on issues relating to opposition to abortion that you've never heard before. So hopefully it'll get your mind ticking. And if over time, months later, if you think about us, please feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to work with you or help you think about these issues in the work you do. Thank you.